The Last Days of Philip II, a king's journey from power to grace, the height of power in the annals of human history. Few individuals have wielded absolute power as Philip II of Spain once did. Yet this story is not about how he conquered the world, but rather how the world ultimately conquered him. What unfolded during the final 52 days of his life would forever change how we understand the relationship between power and vulnerability, between earthly dominion and human frailty. Picture, if you will, a man who once controlled territories so vast that the sun never set upon his realm. From the silver mines of Peru to the spice islands of the Philippines, from the battlefields of the Netherlands to the courts of Italy, Philip II's will was law. His word could elevate peasants to nobility or condemn kings to exile. His signature on a document could alter the fate of entire civilizations. Yet, in the summer of 1598, this same man would find himself utterly powerless against an enemy more relentless than any army, more cunning than any diplomat, and more absolute than any monarch his own mortal flesh. The portrait of a great emperor. Philip II ascended to the Spanish throne in 1556, inheriting from his father, Charles V, an empire that stretched across 4 continents. The Spanish territories in the Americas alone were larger than all of Europe combined, producing wealth that financed the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. The Philippines bore his name, testament to the reach of Spanish influence under his rule. In Europe, he controlled the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and maintained a complex web of alliances that made Madrid the diplomatic center of the Christian world. But Philip was far more than a mere accumulator of territory. He saw himself as the sword and shield of Catholic Christendom, the earthly defender of divine order against the chaos of Protestant heresy. The Spanish Inquisition operated under his authority, and the Counter-Reformation found in him its most powerful patron. When Islamic forces threatened Christian Europe at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, it was Philip's fleet that secured victory. When Protestant England seemed to threaten Catholic unity, he dispatched the mighty Spanish Armada, though fortune would not favor that particular endeavor. What distinguished Philip from other monarchs of his age was his extraordinary attention to detail. While other kings delegated authority to ministers and advisors, Philip insisted on personally reviewing every significant document that crossed his desk. His marginal notes, often consisting of a simple no or yes, could determine whether thousands lived or died, whether wars began or ended, whether entire regions prospered or fell into ruin. Courtiers marveled at his capacity for work. Enemies cursed his meticulous control over every aspect of his vast dominion. This obsession with control extended to his greatest architectural achievement, the Escorial Palace. More than a royal residence, it was designed as a statement of power, a monastery, a mausoleum, and a seat of government all in one. Its austere magnificence reflected Philip's own character grandeur, tempered by religious devotion, power balanced by piety. Here, surrounded by art treasures, religious relics, and the accumulated wisdom of his empire, Philip believed he had created the perfect synthesis of earthly and divine authority, the first omens, yet even before 1598, those closest to Philip had noticed troubling signs. Gout had plagued him since his 30s, transforming his once elegant hands into gnarled appendages that made writing increasingly difficult. The disease had progressed relentlessly, attacking his feet, knees, and shoulders with such severity that by 1591, the king required a wheelchair for mobility. Persistent fevers came and went with disturbing frequency, and a form of arthritis so severe had developed that courtiers described their sovereign as unable to move hand or foot without assistance. These physical ailments were accompanied by a more subtle but equally troubling transformation. The king, who had once been accessible to his subjects, who had maintained the elaborate ceremonials that reinforced royal dignity, now found himself increasingly isolated. The Spanish court, already the most formal in Europe, became even more rigid as protocols were adjusted to accommodate Philip's disabilities. Audiences became rarer. Public appearances virtually ceased, and the king, who had once prided himself on personal involvement in governance, found himself forced to rely more heavily on intermediaries. As spring arrived in 1598, Philip's closest advisors noticed something else troubling a quality of resignation that had never before characterized their famously determined monarch. In private moments, he spoke more frequently of his father's death, of the temporary nature of earthly power, and of his growing concern about whether his son, Philip III, possessed the strength to maintain the empire they had built together. The heroic character in decline. To understand what followed, we must recognize Philip II not merely as a historical figure, but as a profoundly human character caught between earthly ambition and mortal limitation. Like the tragic heroes of Shakespeare's plays, Philip possessed qualities that made him both admirable and vulnerable. His determination to control every aspect of his empire, while it had made him the most powerful man of his age, had also made him a prisoner of his own systems. His deep Catholic faith, while it provided him strength and purpose, also filled him with anxiety about divine judgment and the weight of his sins. The irony that would define his final days was already becoming apparent here. Was a man who could command the loyalty of millions across the globe, yet could not command his own body to obey his will. He who had spent decades dictating terms to emperors and popes would soon find himself negotiating with pain itself. The monarch, who had never accepted defeat from any earthly opponent, would be forced to surrender, inch by agonizing inch, to an enemy that recognized no crown, respected no authority, and showed no mercy to any mortal being. As we prepare to follow Philip into his darkest hours, we must remember that this is not simply a story of physical suffering, though that suffering was profound. Rather, it is a meditation on how human dignity can persist even in the face of ultimate vulnerability, how faith can endure even when the body fails, and how a king's truest test comes not in commanding others, but in facing the inevitable democracy of death with grace. The decline begins, June 1598. Warning signs. The transformation began subtly, as such things often do, in early June of 1598. Philip experienced what his physicians initially dismissed as another bout of the fevers that had periodically troubled him for years. But those closest to the king noticed differences that alarmed them. where previous fevers had left him weakened but mentally sharp. This new affliction brought periods of confusion and delirium. The man who had built his reputation on never forgetting a detail, never overlooking a document, now sometimes struggled to remember conversations from the previous day. More disturbing still were the lesions that began appearing on his right knee and hand. Unlike the predictable swelling of his gout attacks, these wounds seemed to appear without cause and showed no inclination to heal. Court physicians, working with the limited medical knowledge of their time, applied poultices and prescribed bloodletting. But the infection spread with alarming persistence. Within weeks, what had begun as minor irritations had developed into suppurating sores that defied every remedy in the royal medical arsenal. Yet even as his body began its rebellion, Philip's will remained unbroken. From his wheelchair, then from his bed, he continued to review state documents with the same meticulous attention that had characterized his entire reign. His handwriting, never elegant since the gout had twisted his fingers, became increasingly labored, but he refused to allow secretaries to sign documents in his name. "The empire is vast," he told his son during one of their increasingly frequent consultations, "but it is held together by details. Never forget that a kingdom can be lost for want of attention to a single letter." The court watched these developments with growing unease. Courtiers who had grown accustomed to Philip's rigid schedules and predictable routines now found themselves navigating an atmosphere of uncertainty. Whispered conversations in palace corridors speculated about the king's condition, about the readiness of his heir, about the stability of an empire that had become so dependent on one man's tireless oversight. The psychology of an ailing emperor. For a man who had spent his entire adult life in control, the experience of physical deterioration proved psychologically devastating. Philip had always defined himself through his capacity to impose order on chaos, to bend circumstances to his will through careful planning and relentless attention to detail. Now, for the first time in his life, he faced a problem that could not be solved through diplomacy, defeated through military force, or overcome through administrative efficiency. The king's private writings from this period, discovered centuries later among his personal papers, reveal a man grappling with profound questions about divine will and earthly power. "If I am truly God's chosen instrument," he wrote in one fragment, "why does he permit my flesh to betray my spirit? Have I somehow failed in my sacred duty? Or is this trial meant to teach me something I have yet to understand?" This spiritual crisis was compounded by more practical concerns. Philip had spent decades preparing his son for eventual succession, but Philip III, while dutiful and well-educated, lacked his father's iron will and consuming work ethic. The prospect of transferring power to someone he saw as insufficiently prepared filled the dying king with anxiety that may have actually accelerated his physical decline. Perhaps most difficult of all was the gradual erosion of the dignity that had been central to Philip's conception of kingship. Spanish court protocol had evolved over generations to emphasize the sacred nature of royal authority. The king was approached only with elaborate genuflection, addressed only in the most formal terms, and treated as a figure more divine than human. Now, as his condition worsened, Philip found himself increasingly dependent on servants for the most basic human needs a transformation that struck at the very core of his identity, Renaissance medicine and its limitations. The royal physicians who attended Philip during his decline were, by the standards of their time, among the most learned medical practitioners in Europe. They had studied at the finest universities, had access to the latest translations of classical medical texts, and enjoyed unlimited resources to pursue whatever treatments they deemed necessary. Yet their understanding of disease, infection, and the human body remained fundamentally limited by the scientific knowledge of the 16th century. Working within the framework of humoral theory, they believed Philip's condition resulted from an imbalance of the four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Their treatments focused on restoring this supposed balance through bloodletting, purging, and the application of various substances meant to draw out corrupt humors. These interventions, well-intentioned though they were, likely weakened Philip further at precisely the moment when his body needed all its strength to fight infection. The physicians' detailed records of Philip's condition, preserved in the royal archives, provide a clinical picture that modern medical experts can interpret with greater accuracy than was possible in 1598. The combination of symptoms, persistent fever, non-healing wounds, systemic weakness, and eventual multi-organ failure suggests that Philip was likely battling a severe systemic infection, possibly complicated by diabetes and certainly exacerbated by his long-standing autoimmune conditions. What makes these medical records particularly poignant is their documentation of the physician's growing desperation. As conventional treatments failed, they tried increasingly exotic remedies: powdered pearls, gold leaf, extracts from rare plants imported from the New World. The king, who had commanded the wealth of empires, received treatments that cost fortunes, yet proved no more effective than common herbs might have been. The growing isolation. As Philip's condition deteriorated through the summer months, a curious transformation occurred within the Escorial itself. The palace that had been designed as the nerve center of a global empire gradually became something more like a monastery or a hospital. The constant flow of ambassadors, ministers, and petitioners slowed to a trickle as audiences became impossible to schedule with any certainty. The king's famous routine of morning prayers, afternoon document review, and evening consultations gave way to a schedule dictated entirely by the unpredictable rhythms of illness. This isolation was both physical and psychological. As Philip became bedridden, his world shrank from continental scope to the confines of his chamber. The man who had once received daily reports from Mexico City and Manila now sometimes went days without being able to concentrate long enough to read a single dispatch. Communication with the outside world increasingly had to pass through intermediaries, a situation that Philip found almost unbearable given his lifelong insistence on direct personal involvement in all important decisions. Yet, even in isolation, Philip maintained his essential character. When lucid, he still demanded detailed briefings on the state of his territories. He continued to worry about the Dutch rebellion, about the stability of his Italian possessions, about the financial health of the royal treasury. His attendants reported that even during his most difficult moments, he would sometimes mutter about unfinished business, about documents that needed his review, about decisions that only he could make. The psychological effect of this enforced helplessness on a man accustomed to absolute authority cannot be overstated. Philip's entire sense of self had been built around his capacity to control circumstances, to impose his will on a chaotic world through careful planning and relentless oversight. Now, unable to control even his own bodily functions, he faced what was perhaps the greatest crisis of identity any monarch could endure: the recognition that power, no matter how absolute, offers no protection against the fundamental vulnerabilities of human existence. The dark days, July, August, the body's betrayal as the sweltering Spanish summer intensified, so did Philip's suffering. The infections that had begun as minor irritations on his knee and hand spread with relentless persistence, transforming his body into a battlefield where his immune system fought a losing war against bacterial invasion. The wounds became gateways through which corruption entered, turning the king's flesh into something that seemed to rebel against his very existence. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Where once Philip had taken pride in his appearance, maintaining the rigid dignity required of Spanish royalty, he now found himself unable to control even the most basic aspects of his physical presence. The familiar scents of the Escorial incense from the chapel, beeswax from countless candles, the subtle perfumes worn by courtiers gave way to something else entirely, something that spoke of mortality and decay in ways that no amount of royal protocol could disguise. Sleep, which had once provided Philip with respite from the burdens of empire, became a luxury he could rarely afford. Pain had become his constant companion, a counselor more persistent than any advisor, more demanding than any petitioner. During those long nights when rest proved impossible, Philip would sometimes ask his attendants to read from religious texts, finding in the words of Scripture and the lives of the saints a comfort that earthly medicine could not provide. The psychological transformation was as profound as the physical one. Philip, who had spent his entire life as the decision-maker to whom all others deferred, now found himself forced to rely on others for every basic need. The man who had once controlled the movements of armies could no longer control the movements of his own body. This reversal of power dynamics represented more than mere inconvenience. It struck at the very foundations of how Philip understood himself and his place in the world. Yet even in these darkest hours, those who attended him reported moments of remarkable grace. When the pain permitted, Philip would still inquire about affairs of state, still worry about the welfare of his subjects, still show concern for the future of the empire he had spent his life building. The body might be failing, but the mind and spirit that had guided one of history's greatest empires remained fundamentally intact. Witnesses and records, the detailed accounts left by those who attended Philip during his final illness, provide an extraordinary window into both the reality of royal life and the universal experience of human suffering. Diego de Yepes, the king's confessor, maintained careful records not only of Philip's spiritual state, but also of his remarkable composure in the face of overwhelming physical distress. His Majesty bears his trials with a patience that speaks more eloquently of his faith than any sermon ever could. Yepes wrote, "In his suffering, I see not the defeat of a king, but the triumph of a Christian soul. The royal physicians, led by Dr. Andres Zamudio de Alfaro, documented their patient's condition with clinical precision that proves valuable to modern medical historians. Their notes describe symptoms that contemporary doctors can recognize as consistent with systemic bacterial infection, possibly complicated by diabetes, and certainly exacerbated by the very treatments intended to help him. Yet reading these accounts today, one is struck not by their medical limitations, but by their profound humanity. These were learned men genuinely trying to help their sovereign with every tool at their disposal. Perhaps most revealing are the accounts left by court officials and servants who witnessed the king's daily struggle. These records, written by individuals who had grown accustomed to seeing Philip as an almost superhuman figure of authority, reveal their shock at confronting his fundamental humanity. To see the king reduced to such circumstances, wrote one unnamed courtier, is to understand that all earthly glory is but a shadow, all power but a temporary loan from Providence. The palace itself seemed to respond to its master's condition. The Escorial, designed to project power and inspire awe, became instead a place of whispered conversations and muffled footsteps. Courtiers who had once competed for the king's attention now found themselves grateful to be spared the sight of his suffering. The rigid ceremonial that had governed court life for decades gave way to practical necessities, creating an atmosphere unlike anything in the palace's short but glorious history. Faith in the midst of suffering. Throughout his ordeal, Philip's religious faith remained not only intact, but actually deepened. The man who had spent his reign defending Catholic orthodoxy against Protestant challenges now found in that same faith the strength to endure what seemed like divine abandonment. Daily Mass was celebrated in his chamber when he could not travel to the palace chapel, and he frequently requested readings from the lives of the saints, particularly those who had endured great physical suffering. This spiritual dimension of Philip's final days reveals perhaps the most admirable aspect of his character. Rather than raging against his circumstances or demanding to know why God would permit such trials, he accepted his suffering as part of a divine plan that human understanding could not fully comprehend. If our Lord sees fit to test me in this manner, he told his confessor, then I must trust that there is purpose in this trial, even if I cannot see it. The contrast between his earthly situation and his spiritual response struck all who witnessed it. Here was a man who had commanded the resources of empires, yet faced his greatest trial with nothing but faith to sustain him. The king who had dispatched armies to defend Christendom now fought his most important battle armed only with prayer and resignation to divine will. In the eyes of many observers, this transformation from sovereign to suffering servant represented not a defeat, but a kind of victory, the triumph of the human spirit over purely material concerns. Philip's approach to his suffering also reflected the deep influence of Spanish mysticism on his character. The writings of Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, both of whom had found in physical and spiritual trials a path to closer union with God, provided him with a framework for understanding his experience. Rather than seeing his illness as meaningless torment, he began to speak of it as a purification, a final preparation for the encounter with divine judgment that awaited all mortals. Controlled decline. even as his body failed him. Philip struggled to maintain some measure of control over his empire and his destiny. Unable to rise from his bed, he transformed his chamber into a makeshift office, receiving daily briefings from his most trusted advisors and attempting to stay current with the vast correspondence that had always been central to his method of governance. His signature, already shaky from years of gout, became increasingly labored, but he refused to delegate this most personal symbol of royal authority. These final, administrative acts reveal both Philip's dedication to duty and his growing awareness that his time was limited. Letters from this period show him attempting to resolve long-standing problems, to provide guidance for his successor, and to ensure that the transition of power would proceed as smoothly as possible. "The empire is like a great ship," he told his son during one of their conversations. "It has tremendous momentum, but it requires constant steering. Never let it drift, even for a moment." His conversations with Philip III during these weeks were particularly poignant. The dying king struggled to impart not just practical knowledge about governance, but also the deeper wisdom he had gained through decades of wielding absolute power. He spoke of the loneliness of command, the weight of making decisions that affected millions of lives, and the constant tension between earthly duty and spiritual responsibility. "A king serves many masters," he observed: "his subjects, his God, his conscience, and history itself." Learning to balance these claims is the art of kingship. Perhaps most remarkably, Philip used his final weeks to attempt a kind of spiritual accounting of his reign. Working with his confessor, he reviewed the major decisions of his rule, seeking to understand where he had acted correctly and where he might have erred. This process was not one of morbid self-recrimination, but rather of honest self-examination, the effort of a man trying to present himself before his Maker with as clear a conscience as possible. The final days September. Acceptance. As September arrived, bringing with it the first hints of autumn's cooling, Philip experienced what his attendants could only describe as a transformation of spirit. The king, who had fought against his circumstances with all the determination that had made him master of half the world, now seemed to find peace in acceptance. This change was not one of defeat or despair, but rather of a profound recognition that his earthly work was nearly complete. The practical arrangements for succession, which had occupied much of Philip's attention throughout the summer, were now largely settled. His son, despite his inexperience, had been thoroughly briefed on the major challenges facing the empire. Trusted advisors had been chosen to guide the new king through his early years of rule. The administrative machinery that Philip had spent decades perfecting would continue to function, at least for a time, on the momentum he had given it. More important than these practical matters was Philip's spiritual preparation for death. Working closely with his confessor, he made what Catholics call a general confession, a comprehensive review of his entire life's sins and failings. This process, which took several days due to his weakened condition, represented Philip's final act as a practicing Catholic seeking to prepare his soul for divine judgment. Those who witnessed these sessions reported that the king showed remarkable humility and genuine contrition, approaching death not as a defeated monarch, but as a penitent Christian. His physical condition, while still causing considerable discomfort, seemed somehow less central to his experience during these final weeks. Pain remained his constant companion, but Philip appeared to have found resources for dealing with it that transcended mere endurance. Visitors remarked on a quality of serenity that seemed almost supernatural, as if the king had discovered in his suffering a pathway to a peace that had eluded him throughout his years of worldly success. The conversations from this period, recorded by those privileged to share Philip's final days, reveal a man who had achieved a remarkable integration of his various roles and identities. The warrior king, the defender of the faith, the loving father, and the mortal human being seemed finally to have found harmony with one another. "I have been many things in this life," he told his son, "but in the end, I am simply a man returning to his Creator, hoping that my service has been acceptable." The deathbed scene. The final day, September 13th, 1598, dawned with an unusual clarity that seemed to extend beyond the weather to encompass Philip's mental state as well. Those attending him reported that the king appeared more lucid and peaceful than he had been in weeks, as if approaching death had brought with it a gift of final grace. He requested that morning mass be celebrated in his chamber and received communion with a devotion that moved all present to tears as word spread through the palace that the end was near. Members of the royal family and the highest court officials gathered in the antechambers surrounding the king's room. The atmosphere was one of solemn expectation rather than panic or despair. Philip had used his final weeks so well to prepare both his family and his empire for this moment that his approaching death, while deeply mourned, did not create the crisis that many had feared. The king's final conversations with his son revealed the depth of wisdom that Philip had gained through his long ordeal. "Remember," he told the future Philip III, "that a crown is not an ornament, but a burden. Wear it with humility, and never forget that all earthly power is temporary. Serve God first, your subjects second, and yourself last." These words, recorded by several witnesses, would become a kind of testament that guided Spanish royal policy for generations to come. Perhaps most remarkable was Philip's composure during his final hours. The man who had once commanded vast armies and controlled the wealth of continents faced his ultimate defeat with extraordinary dignity. He asked for his father's crucifix to be placed upon his chest, the same cross that Charles V had held during his own final moments, thus creating a tangible link between past and future that seemed to provide comfort to both father and son. As the afternoon wore on, Philip's breathing became increasingly labored, but his mind remained clear. He spoke briefly with each member of his family, offering final words of blessing and guidance. To his daughter Isabella, he entrusted the care of his son. To his advisors, he emphasized the importance of maintaining unity within the empire. To his confessor, he expressed his trust in divine mercy and his hope for eventual reunion with those who had gone before him. At 5 o'clock in the morning of September 13th, after requesting one final prayer, Philip II of Spain drew his last breath. Those present reported that his passing was peaceful, almost serene, a stark contrast to the anguish that had characterized so much of his final illness. The king, who had lived his entire adult life in the service of power, had found, in powerlessness, a kind of victory that transcended any of his worldly conquests. Immediate aftermath. The challenge of preparing Philip's body for burial revealed the extent to which his final illness had ravaged the flesh that had once housed one of history's most formidable intellects. The royal embalmers, working with techniques that were state-of-the-art for their time, found their task complicated by the advanced deterioration that months of systemic infection had wrought. Yet they persevered, driven by the need to present their departed sovereign in a manner befitting his earthly dignity. The funeral arrangements, planned for months in advance, proceeded with the elaborate ceremonial that Spanish protocol demanded. Yet those who had witnessed Philip's final days could not help but note the contrast between the magnificent pageantry of death and the humble reality of the man's last months. The king, who was now being honored with every possible earthly tribute, had found his greatest triumph not in ceremony, but in simple human courage. News of Philip's death spread across Europe with the speed that important intelligence always achieved in that interconnected world of diplomacy and trade. Reactions varied dramatically depending on the recipient's relationship with the deceased monarch. In Catholic territories, particularly those under Spanish influence, Philip was mourned as a defender of the faith whose passing marked the end of an era. In Protestant regions, particularly England and the Dutch Republic, his death was received with barely concealed relief, though even his enemies acknowledged his formidable character. What struck contemporary observers across the political spectrum was how Philip's manner of dying seemed to encapsulate the essential contradictions of his character and his age. Here was a man who had embodied absolute power, yet had faced absolute powerlessness with remarkable grace. The monarch who had been feared as a tyrant had revealed, in his final trial, qualities of faith and endurance that even his enemies found admirable. The Catholic king, who had waged war against heretics, had discovered in his own suffering a kind of universal human experience that transcended religious boundaries. Modern medical analysis. Contemporary medical experts who have studied the detailed records of Philip's final illness can provide diagnoses that were impossible for 16th century physicians to make. The constellation of symptoms: persistent fever, non-healing wounds, systemic weakness, and eventual multi-organ failure strongly suggests that Philip was battling a severe staphylococcal infection, possibly complicated by diabetes mellitus, and certainly exacerbated by the autoimmune conditions that had plagued him for years. The progression of his illness follows patterns that modern doctors recognize as typical of systemic bacterial infection in an immunocompromised patient. The gout and arthritis that had troubled Philip for decades were likely manifestations of autoimmune disease, which would have left him particularly vulnerable to opportunistic infections. The wounds that appeared on his extremities provided entry points for bacteria, which then spread throughout his system faster than his weakened immune defenses could contain them. Perhaps most tragic from a modern perspective is the recognition that many of the treatments prescribed by Philip's physicians, bloodletting, purging, and the application of caustic substances to his wounds, likely hastened his decline rather than helping him recover. The medical knowledge gap of the 16th century meant that well-intentioned interventions actually weakened the king at precisely the moment when his body needed all its resources to fight infection. Yet this medical analysis, while important for historical understanding, should not overshadow the more significant human dimensions of Philip's story. Even if modern medicine could have prolonged his life, it could not have changed the fundamental reality that all mortals must eventually face: the recognition that physical existence is temporary and that life's ultimate meaning must be found in something beyond mere biological survival. Historical reactions and interpretations. The immediate European reaction to news of Philip's death revealed the complex legacy of his long reign. In Protestant territories, particularly England and the Netherlands, pamphlets and broadsheets portrayed his suffering as divine retribution for the Spanish Inquisition and the suppression of Protestant reformers. These accounts, often embellished with sensational details, presented Philip's death as evidence that God opposed religious tyranny and would ultimately vindicate those who suffered for their faith. Catholic writers, by contrast, emphasized Philip's piety during his final trial and his acceptance of suffering as a form of spiritual purification. They portrayed his death not as punishment, but as the final test of a faithful servant, one that he had passed with exemplary Christian virtue. These accounts stressed his continued devotion to religious duties even during his most difficult moments, and his concern for the spiritual welfare of his subjects, even as his own earthly life ebbed away. Perhaps most interesting are the reactions of neutral observers, diplomats, merchants, and intellectuals who had no particular stake in either Catholic or Protestant interpretations of Philip's death. These accounts, often found in private correspondence and diplomatic reports, tend to focus on the purely human dimensions of the king's final days. They express admiration for his composure under extreme circumstances and recognition that his manner of dying had revealed admirable qualities that his political opponents had not previously acknowledged. Over the centuries, historians have continued to grapple with the meaning of Philip's death within the larger context of his reign and his historical significance. Some have seen in his final illness a metaphor for the decline of Spanish power, the body politic failing even as the physical body succumbed to corruption. Others have interpreted his dignified response to suffering as evidence of the positive influence of Catholic spirituality on political leadership. Still others have focused on the universal human themes in his story, seeing in Philip's experience a reminder that all earthly authority is temporary and that life's ultimate tests are often intensely personal rather than public. Philosophical reflections. Philip II's death serves as one of history's most powerful examples of what the Romans called memento mori, remember that you must die. His story demonstrates with unusual clarity how even the most absolute earthly power offers no protection against the fundamental vulnerabilities of human existence. The king, who controlled territories spanning 4 continents, could not control the cellular processes of his own body. The monarch, whose word was law throughout half the known world, found himself subject to laws of biology and mortality that recognized no crown, respected no authority, and showed mercy to no mortal being. Yet the deeper significance of Philip's story lies not in the simple fact of his mortality, but in how he chose to face that mortality. Confronted with circumstances that stripped away every external source of identity and power, he discovered resources of character that had perhaps been hidden even from himself during his years of worldly success. The dignity with which he endured his final trial, his continued concern for others despite his own overwhelming pain, and his ability to find meaning in suffering all speak to qualities of human spirit that transcend political or religious boundaries. His experience also illuminates the complex relationship between power and vulnerability. Throughout history, those who wield great authority often become isolated from the common human experiences that shape character and teach wisdom. Philip's final illness forced him into an encounter with fundamental human realities: pain, dependence, mortality that his royal status had previously allowed him to avoid or delegate to others. In this enforced confrontation with his own humanity, he discovered not defeat, but a kind of victory. Not the collapse of dignity, but its ultimate expression. The philosophical implications extend beyond individual character to broader questions about the nature of leadership and authority. Philip's example suggests that a leader's truest test may come not in moments of triumph, but in times of trial. Not when exercising power, but when confronting powerlessness. His ability to maintain concern for his empire and his subjects, even while enduring extreme personal suffering, reveals a conception of duty that transcends self-interest and approaches the sacrificial ideal that lies at the heart of authentic leadership. Lessons for the modern age. While the specific circumstances of Philip II's death belong to a bygone era, the human themes in his story remain remarkably relevant to contemporary concerns. In an age when medical technology has extended life expectancy and improved quality of life for many, we may be tempted to believe that human ingenuity can ultimately overcome all forms of suffering and limitation. Philip's example reminds us that technological advancement, while valuable, cannot eliminate the fundamental realities of human existence, the reality of physical vulnerability, the inevitability of loss, and the ultimate need to find meaning that transcends material circumstances. His story also speaks to contemporary discussions about leadership and the exercise of power. In democratic societies, we may assume that the concentration of authority in a single individual is inherently problematic. Yet Philip's example demonstrates that even absolute power can be wielded with genuine concern for others' welfare. More significantly, his final days reveal how authentic leadership may be most clearly expressed not in commanding others, but in commanding oneself, maintaining dignity, purpose, and concern for others, even when external supports have been stripped away. For healthcare professionals, Philip's experience offers insights into the relationship between cure and care. While 16th century medicine could do little to address the king's underlying conditions, those who attended him were still able to provide comfort, maintain his dignity, and help him find meaning in his suffering. This reminds us that medical practice, at its best, encompasses not just the treatment of disease, but the care of persons, human beings, who must find ways to live meaningfully, even when cure is not possible. Perhaps most importantly, Philip's story challenges us to consider how we ourselves might face the ultimate tests that await all mortals. His example suggests that preparation for such tests cannot be achieved through accumulating wealth, power, or even medical knowledge, but rather through developing the inner resources: faith, courage, compassion, and wisdom that sustain human dignity even in the most difficult circumstances. As we reach the end of this journey through Philip II's final days, it is important to recognize what his story ultimately represents. This is not primarily a tale of defeat or divine punishment, nor is it simply an exercise in historical voyeurism that allows us to observe the sufferings of the powerful with detached fascination. Rather, it is a profoundly human story about the discovery of grace in the midst of trial, about the possibility of maintaining dignity even when all external supports have been stripped away. Philip II was neither the saintly figure portrayed by some Catholic hagiographers, nor the demonic tyrant depicted by Protestant propagandists. He was a human being complex, flawed, capable of both greatness and error, who found himself confronting the universal human experience of mortality under circumstances that few could imagine enduring. What makes his story remarkable is not the extraordinary nature of his suffering, but the ordinary virtues he displayed in responding to it: courage, faith, concern for others, and the determination to find meaning even in meaningless pain. His death was not a punishment for earthly ambitions, but rather a reminder that all human achievements, no matter how magnificent, are temporary. The empire he built would eventually decline. The palaces he constructed would become museums, and the political arrangements he established would be swept away by the tides of history. Yet the example he set in facing his final trial with dignity, with faith, and with continued concern for others has endured across the centuries as a testament to the possibilities of human character under extreme duress. In our darkest moments, when we feel overwhelmed by circumstances beyond our control, when the future seems uncertain and the present unbearable, Philip II's example reminds us that grace can be found even in the most desperate situations. Not the grace that removes suffering, for that was not granted to him, but the grace that enables us to transform suffering into something meaningful, to find in our trials not just endurance, but even a kind of victory. His story calls us to live meaningful lives while we can, to use whatever power we possess, whether vast like Philip's or modest like that of ordinary citizens, in service of others, and in pursuit of purposes larger than ourselves. It reminds us that our ultimate worth will be measured not by what we accomplished in moments of strength, but by how we responded in times of weakness, not by how we wielded authority, but by how we faced its inevitable loss. Most importantly, Philip II's final days teach us that the distance between the heights of human achievement and the depths of human vulnerability is not as great as we might wish to believe, but neither is the distance between human frailty and human grace. In recognizing our common mortality, we may discover our capacity for uncommon courage. In accepting our limitations, we may find our truest strength, and in facing our own eventual trials with the same dignity that Philip showed in facing his, we may discover that even in our darkest hours, it is possible to find light. The king who once ruled half the world learned, in his final days, to rule himself. In doing so, he achieved a victory more lasting than any military conquest, more valuable than any territorial acquisition, and more worthy of memory than any earthly crown. This, perhaps, is the most important lesson his story offers, that in the end, the kingdom that matters most is the one we establish within ourselves. a realm where courage conquers fear, where faith transcends doubt, and where love proves stronger than death itself. As we close this chapter of history and return to our own lives, we carry with us the image of a dying king who faced his ultimate trial not with the resources of empire, but with the simple virtues available to all human beings: patience, faith, courage, and love. His example reminds us that these qualities, far from being consolation prizes for those who lack worldly power, are in fact the most precious possessions any mortal can hope to attain. They cannot prevent suffering, but they can transform it. They cannot guarantee earthly success, but they can ensure that our lives, however brief, contribute something of value to the human story. In this light, Philip II's final 52 days become not a tale of royal decline, but a story of human triumph. The triumph of character over circumstance, of spirit over flesh, of eternal values over temporal concerns. It is a story that belongs not just to Spanish history or Catholic hagiography, but to the entire human family, offering hope and guidance to all who must someday face their own final trials with nothing but their character to sustain them. The sun has long since set on the Spanish Empire, but the light kindled by one man's courage in his darkest hour continues to illumine the path for all who would live and die with dignity. This, ultimately, is Philip II's greatest legacy, not the territories he conquered or the policies he enacted, but the example he set of how a human being can face the ultimate defeat and transform it into the ultimate victory.